Welcome back to the Changemaker podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. Today, my guest is Manu Meel. Manu is passionate about empowering young people to bridge divides. He believes that the biggest threat to American democracy is polarization. As CEO of BridgeUSA, Manu is leading the largest and fastest growing student movement to bridge our differences and change how we talk politics. Manu contributes to several news outlets, works on pro-democracy efforts nationally, and advises political leaders on reducing polarization. He currently serves on the boards of Convergence, American Promise, and Bridge Alliance, and he's a member of the Monticello Youth Advisors Committee. In the past, Manu interned as an associate at the venture capital firm Amplo and at the Department of State as a political analyst in counterterrorism. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and other media platforms. And in 2022, Manu was recognized on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for leading BridgeUSA. Very impressive, Manu, and welcome to the show.
Welcome to the Changemaker podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that the Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
Deke, I'm so sad and sorry to hear that the audience had to hear that entire bio because it sets a real standard now that I have to meet. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm grateful to what you do and the work that you do. I appreciate you.
Yeah, man. Well, I will tell you, you're 22 years old?
23. That's the word on the street.
23. That's an impressive bio for anybody of any age, but it really you're doing amazing work with BridgeUSA, and so just for our audience, for our viewers, for our listeners, tell them a little bit about how BridgeUSA got started and how you got started with it.
Well, let me say first that, I stand on some incredibly tall shoulders, whether it was my mentors, some of my best friends that have helped me get to this point, or the chapter leaders who are the most important part of my story, and they're the reason why I have something to talk about. Let me tell you a little bit about how this all happened, as you asked. So I was, as I've told you before, a pre-med student at UC Berkeley. In 2017, I was a freshman. I graduated in 2020. I had no interest in our politics, but in our second semester of my freshman year, we had these massive protests because the speaker by the name of Milo Yiannopoulos came to campus. And at that time when those protests were happening, we went to Berkeley. We know Berkeley's history. We love protests. We protest big things, small things. And so I took nothing of that. And those protests actually became the second largest protest since the 1960s free speech movement. And I vividly remember the next day, me and a couple of people who are now some of my best friends thought, hey, let's just create a space for people to hear each other, listen to each other. Let's just have talk therapy for campus after those protests. That was it. Turns out, Deke, people love to talk to each other, and people actually appreciate the opportunity to hear and empathize across difference and understand why you and I believe what you believe. And so that space caught on, and so we turned that into Bridge Berkeley. We had these amazing folks out at Notre Dame in Colorado Boulder that created Bridge Notre Dame, Bridge CU Boulder. And the reason why I tell that story is because the formation of Bridge is a very organic formation. We're a youth-led movement trying to combat polarization, but importantly, revitalizing hope and understanding in our democracy. And the last thing I'll just say is that we're currently on 50 college campuses, 20 high school campuses, and our goal is that there is so much hunger and appetite, which you've seen across the country, for empathy, for dialogue, for humanizing folks. So let's make it happen, and that's what we're doing.
Well, so you're on 50 college campuses, which is amazing, but you've got Bridge Europe and Bridge Africa as well.
Yes, I'm total coincidence, but yesterday we just had our quarterly call catch up with Bridge Europe yesterday morning. To me, those two organizations are a symbol of the fact that this is a global movement. I mean, what we're advocating for is basic human nature. This isn't about just American politics. This is about how we as a people organize in society. And what I would say is that the Bridge Europe folks and the Bridge Africa folks started completely independent of each other. It was students in central Germany that heard about Bridge USA and said, hey, let's create Bridge Europe. It was students in Kenya near Nairobi that said, hey, let's create Bridge Africa, and they created Bridge Africa. This is an organic movement that capitalizes on the bed of the human spirit, which is that we want kindness and empathy in our politics.
Yeah, and it's so encouraging to me to see the movement spread to Europe and to Africa. And it's interesting, I talk a lot, Manu, and you and I have had these conversations, that people look at society these days and they usually look at it through the lens of politics as usual, the polarization of the media, and they see, a country and frankly a world divided. But you see through the bridge building movement, and I see that I don't think we're that far apart. And I've often said, some people see a nation divided. I see a nation yearning and a world yearning to come together.
Well, let me ask you this, Deke. Why do you have that hope? I'm curious. I'm curious how you approach it because I've learned so much from you. So I want to hear why you think that's the case.
Well, I'll give you a prime example. You and I both have the experience through Starts With Us recently of interviewing people for Starts With Us on the street. And so I spent 5 hours at our local farmers market with, over 1,000 people, extremely diverse backgrounds, and asking them the questions that you had to do it in San Francisco. I want to see more of in America and less. I want to see more love, less hate. I want to see more unity. I want to see less division. And that was, from blue-haired 20-something-year-old girls to elderly African-American people to, it was across the board. And so spending that 5 hours, it just shows me, and I had one gentleman say, an older black gentleman, he said, you know what, people say we're divided, just look around. And I'm like, I hope that, I know that got caught on tape. But when we had our first Zoom call, you having done the same thing in San Francisco said, basically, you got the same answers there.
I mean, that's exactly right. I wanted the audience to know that when you and I talk about this work, this is highly accessible stuff. Just get out there and have a conversation with someone that's different than you. I mean, I know we see this world and we look at the silos of social media, and we look at the silos of our families and the silos of us as individuals. And the fact is that it's all in our control, right? It's all in our control. It is instinctual to want to be in your tribe, to plant the flag, and then not be able to cross over just to see what the other tribe's doing and thinking. And what I'm always grateful for is the opportunity to be able to challenge anyone that's ever listening to our work to think about how they can actually actualize this in their life. Because it's not just enough for you and I to talk about this. It's important for people to feel empowered to take the action. And so the fact that you shared that story, I mean, it's an example of what anyone can do. Go to your farmer's market, go to your local campus, go to your church, and just hit up the person next to you and say, what's going on? And the moment we start breaking down our relationships to family members and to getting to know each other and understanding that, you might have had heart surgery and I might have had a recent family tragedy, and that you and I are people, that is very important.
Well, and I've said it before that through COVID, we're bound by our common humanity. And, when you look at the mental health issues that come along with that, and I think it's your generation from the research I've done has been hit harder than any other generation, but that's impacting people every place. So can we come together around that? How are we going to address the long-term mental health issues coming from COVID? But there's just so much more that unites us, and it's exciting to for me to get outside of my tribe. So we have a festival here in Augusta that we had last weekend. So it's called Arts in the Heart of Augusta. This was the 40th edition. Brings 100,000 people downtown, annual economic impact
Wow.
of like $4 million to celebrate arts and culture and diversity. in 40 editions of that, we have never had an incidence of violence. And that to me is, an amazing thing, but that shows to me that our community, and I think most communities at the grassroots level, embrace diversity and inclusion.
So there's two things that I want to really build on there. The first is this notion that you never had an incident of violence at this festival and occurrence of unity and happiness and enjoyment over 40 years. And the second thing that I want to touch on is common humanity. So on the point of a festival like that not having violence, one of the biggest questions that I get asked in this work is who is allowed into the conversation? Where do you draw the line? On our college chapters, on our high school campuses, people often ask the direct question, do you allow Nazis to show up to your discussions? Do you allow the far left to show up to your discussions? Who's allowed? And to your point, we've held over 1,000 bridge events over the last 5 years, and not a single Nazi has ever showed up. Not a single person that wants to commit acts of violence has showed up. It's because when you build spaces of openness and empathy, those folks are not going to show up. That's not the audience that is coming. Who are coming are people that are interested in it, and we got to empower them. Sorry, you want to jump in? Go ahead, and then I'll take the second part about.
No. I just want to validate your point, and so I had a local call-in radio show for over a year, or for around a year. So it was a 3-hour-a-day call-in show. It was on conservative talk radio. But so my phone lines were open to everybody. And there was in just at a year, there was only one guy that would call in that was, he would accuse me of letting in immigrants and that, immigrants were everywhere in Augusta, illegal aliens.
Yeah.
And I would ask the guy, I said, well, how do you know that? He said, well, you can drive around the city and every job site is full of illegal immigrants. I said, have you checked their paperwork? And he'd say, well, no, but it's common knowledge. So I would politely listen to the guy, but then I would just say, well, thanks for your opinion and hang up. But to me, in close to a year of having a call-in show that's open to everybody, it was anybody who wanted to call in, the phone lines were open. And but the vibe was not, the space was not that type of space. To your point, it was not, my audience was not the audience of people that are extremists.
Yeah, it's a very funny paradox, which is a paradox of the fact that the loudest voices control our politics, right? So like that one person that shows up, that is the loudest, paints the entire prognosis of society, and yet the case is that most people are like you and I. We want to listen, we want to engage. So the challenge for us, I think, is not that there isn't demand for this. The challenge is, how do we make building bridges, listening to people, sound exciting, sound interesting, sound like it's on the cutting edge of politics? Because we operate on colleges and high schools, which are some of the hardest places to win politically, because you have young people that live highly busy lives with short attention spans and have commitments all over the place. And importantly, they show up wide-eyed, ready to create change, whether you're on the left or the right. And so to win in that type of environment, you have to make the case that this isn't just squishy stuff that we all sit around a circle and have a bonfire over. Building bridges, listening to folks, understanding cross differences is the backbone of progress. To create a society that allows us to continue building forward, to create what Martin Luther King talked about, that the moral arc of the universe always bends in the direction of justice. That happens because we can create coalitions and we can listen. So I think the challenge for you and I is, how do we take these experiences that we see and feel? How do we take the instance where that elderly African-American gentleman said, just look around, we're not divided. How do you make that stuff sound real to people, right? How do you make that stuff sound like it is on the winning side of politics? Because right now we face a deep problem of apathy towards this work, because people have either put their hands up and said, the problem's too big, I'm going to disengage, I'm going to either go to my farm or my apartment in the inner city and hang out, or hyper engage. And I think it's important. I don't know, I'm curious what you think about that. What do you sort of think about this notion that we've got to make this stuff on the cutting edge.
I I totally agree. And somebody asked me, "How do you see this turning out?" I said, "Well, you've got to make it too big to ignore." And I think, I think visually, but I think about the starts with us on the street, that 100 minutes of interviews that I did and the interviews that you did and the ones that were done in San Antonio, that's real. That's documentation that this is what people want. And it's interesting to me, though, in the best case scenario, democracy and politicians, elected officials are there to serve the will of the people. Well, I think really I saw what the will of the people is in Augusta, and you saw that in San Francisco, and I'm sure they saw that in San Antonio. People want to move beyond polarization.
Yeah.
It's not healthy for anybody. But I think, so my book, I tell people, is not a self-help book, but it's sort of a case study in how you can do politics differently and be successful. But I give illustrations. So the first big economic development deal that I worked on was automatic data processing. So in my first meeting with them, they talked about their commitment to diversity. So understanding that we have a diverse labor force helped bring in a Fortune 300 company and create 1,000 jobs. They've since doubled their footprint and doubled their employment. So that's that, as you say, to your point, that's not touchy-feely stuff. I mean, that's real when, a company that has a commitment to diversity and inclusion chose Augusta because we have a diverse labor force.
It's an example of the fact that this is a method of creating progress and change. I mean, it's the name of your podcast, right? The Changemaker podcast.
Yeah.
To be an effective change maker, or in your case, to be an effective mayor, or to be an effective CEO of a company, or to be the head of a family, or to be a community leader, requires you to be intellectually humble, and requires us to be able to sacrifice our sense of self-importance so that other people can coexist with us, right? And that is essential to whether it is negotiating a business deal in your case, or it's to ensure that the local community project completes on time, or it's to manage disagreement. And I think, when you talk about diversity, which is a word that's come up many times, my generation is the most diverse generation in the history of this country. By 2045, this country is going to be a majority-minority country. Yeah. That stuff excites me, and at the same time, it scares the bejesus out of me. And that's someone as a brown person. So anyone that's listening, I'm an Indian American, and my parents immigrated to the U.S. in '98. I was born in December of '98. And then I lived with my grandparents in India for about 4 to 5 years and then came back to the U.S. I deeply believe in the immigrant story, but here's the fact. To be able to navigate and capitalize on diversity, to be able to make sure that the experiment that we're about to embark on in 2045, which is to have the most diverse democracy in the history of humanity, requires us to be able to understand each other. It requires empathy. It requires us to not silo. Humans don't naturally exist outside of their tribes. Whether it's race, whether it's your religion, whether it's your sports team, we love our groups. So to be able to unlock the power of that diversity, this work has to succeed. Because I see a world in which either that creates the best moment that America can achieve, which is capitalizing and being a boiling pot for all of these different examples, and to build something that is greater than what it was, e pluribus unum, out of many one, or alternatively fracture. And I think that people take it for granted that people just are able to coexist. So this level of polarization, tribalism we see right now, this deep level of anxiety towards change, I think that the only way you capture that and create what I call sort of an emotional absorptive safety net for a lot of that is you've got to be able to have bridge building. You've got to be able to listen to people. Diversity only is a thing in terms of value add if you can unlock the power of that diversity.
Well, it's interesting. So I came from a background in business before I became mayor. So I was in real estate and development at one point. And in real estate, everybody has to sit at the negotiating table and you have to come to a meeting of the minds. Mm-hmm. And so to me, I always focused on the win-win situation. Everybody gets up feeling like they got what they wanted out of the deal. But what I see with political polarization is to to solve the big picture problems facing our nation, whether it's healthcare, immigration, affordable housing, there's a whole list of them. Both sides have to be sitting at the negotiating table. And through polarization, it just doesn't appear that the extremes are even willing to sit at the negotiating table with each other.
And here's the trick, is that the extremes do not represent most of us, right? That's something that
Yeah.
you and I have seen so many times over and over again, whether it is that one person that called into your radio show, right, and asked and talked about illegal immigrants being everywhere, or it's me meeting this one person on my road trip where I met hundreds of people that is loud and a little crazy with their views. Those are the folks that are running our politics, right? Those are the folks that are showing up to the polls. They're the most active primary voters. We often think that politicians lead, but actually they're following their constituents. And if only the loudest voices are percolating to the top, then the politicians are responding to those voices. And so when I think about, the will of the people, and to your point, how do you get folks to engage? There's a couple of things. I think first, anyone that believes in what it is that we're doing, which is let's have an open-minded democracy that values people's experiences, you have to be louder than those extremes. You've got to be louder. You've got to make your voice heard. Know that you are actually in the majority. There are so many countless times, Deke, I've heard people say, I feel like I'm in the minority. I mean, all I want is listening, respect, solving problems. And I'm like, no. This is the perfect example of everyone being quiet, assuming that the loudest voices are what everyone is hearing. And that's just not the case. So we've got to flip those social incentives. Our theory of change has to be a theory of change focused on disempowering the extremes and empowering the temperamental middle.
Yeah, and that's I governed to the middle for 9 years in office, and won 3 elections with an average of 64% of the vote doing it.
Right, which is
It's
amazing.
hard, but I got the vocal minority on the extremes of either end. The far left and the far right had problems with me at any given time, and I'm like, if I've got the extremes on either side pissed off at me, I'm probably doing
You're
what's right for the majority of the people that I serve. I mean, it wouldn't if you don't piss off the extremes, you're not governing to the middle
and
and
let
to
me
the majority.
and let me defend you for a quick second, because someone's going to hear govern to the middle. So that must mean that Deke is some centrist that doesn't have beliefs. And let me say this. When we're talking about the middle, what we're talking about is solving problems. What we've got to do is we've got to change when people think middle. This is not any longer a battle of the x-axis, the left-right. This is a battle of mindset and temperament, the y-axis.
Yep.
Right? And when we talk about the middle, you can be anywhere ideologically. We've got to have a democracy with strong disagreements. You've got to have a democracy where people are jumping in, right? The question is, when we talk about the middle, it is anyone that is willing to hear, solve problems, show up first for each other. That's the middle. And so that is a tent and that is a tribe, in my opinion, that I think is larger than those small ideological tribes.
Exactly, and it's well, if you're not to the extreme, you're not taking a stand. I'm like, if your views on any situation, any issue, are completely intractable, what is
How do you get
that?
through life? How does a person like that get through life, Deke?
Well, it's so before I ran for office, I went to a Republican Party meeting here in Augusta, and we had a new state legislator. And so somebody introduced her and said, she's voted down party lines on every single one of her votes. And I'm like, a computer or a monkey could do that. Why do you need representation if you're just vowing that you're going to vote down party lines on everything? It's not all black and white, it's gray. And really, to solve the problems, as you say, we've got to engage the middle, because that is the majority. But here again, our politicians, is it not designed for elected officials to serve the will of the people? And if the people are saying, and this is what we have to do, is magnify those voices and use every platform we've got. But if the majority of people are saying, I'm sick of polarization, but I don't know anything to do about it, we've just got to give those people that are, it doesn't even, moderate is a lukewarm term, but it's people that are open-minded, I would
Yep.
think is a better way to describe them.
It's what I've started to call the temperamental middle, not the ideological middle, the temperamental
Yeah.
middle. You can call it the behavioral middle. You can call it the mindset middle. The fact is, it is anyone that shares that mindset. I want to give, if you don't mind, I'm going to share a quick story because I think this elucidates what we're getting at. So, when I was this was my second semester freshman year. So after those protests, I remember we were in this class seminar, and it was about 15 students, if I remember correctly. And one kid stands up and he starts sort of protesting the class, saying, we're forwarding exclusive ideologies, and this is not helpful. And he starts shouting at the professor. And then this other kid stands up and starts shouting back at him. And the rest of us 13 stayed silent. And we all left that class meeting thinking, well, everyone must either be for one of these people, right? They must be for one of these people because everyone's just silent. And I guess this is the norm and this is all right. And what I quickly realized was if one of us out of that 13 had stood up and said, no, actually, we need to resolve our differences. Let's have a dialogue. Let's have a conversation. Let's figure out what went wrong. The other 12 would have been on that person's side. That is the fundamental law of our politics and what needs to happen here. Is our job is to get one or two people in that temperamental middle to raise their hand because us humans love it when we can latch onto something. We love that vehicle. Right now, no one is seeing our voices elevate and externalize. So as a result, the only thing that you see is Fox News and MSNBC. And so you either got to hyper engage for that team or you got to disengage. So it is as simple as that class for me. It is there's a Stanford experiment, Deke, a social psychology experiment. I'm going to nerd out for a quick second, but I think the folks will appreciate this. For anyone that's listening, I'm an Indian kid with glasses from Berkeley, so you can expect that I'm a little bit of a nerd. And there's a social psychology experiment conducted at Stanford. I'm going to skewer the numbers a little bit, but the point is there. They had 10 people sit in a line, and they administered a multiple choice test with 3 choices, A, B, and C, and 1 question. Now, this question was extraordinarily obvious. Anyone could pick the right answer, and the right answer is supposed to be C. But in the first trial, the Stanford folks tell the first 7 people to pick A on purpose. So everyone picks A, and mind you, the right answer is C. Everyone picks A. They get to the 8th person, and the 8th person also picks A. Afterwards, they interviewed that 8th person. They asked him, what did you think was the right answer? And he thought, I think it was C. But everyone else said A. In the next trial, they had the first 3 people say A. Number 4 said C, which is the right answer. And the next 3 said A again. But then the 8th person picked C because he was given the social permission to be able to say what was on their mind. It is all about human nature. We are social creatures. It's very simple stuff. And we love following. And we want to have the social permission to be able to externalize our perspective. So in other words, when I take a lesson away from that, whether it is my classroom example or it's the Stanford psychology experiment, or it is us going on the streets and hearing most people say, well, I must be in the minority because I don't hear anyone else saying this. It is a simple fact that we have to flip the incentive structures in our society so that people are incentivized to follow our mindset and to disempower the extreme mindset because that's all they see.
Well, that's, I think part of, to me, I've always had a rebellious streak.
Yeah.
And
well, you're more
bridge building
special.
to
You're more
me-
special than most of us. You've got the maverick in you.
But I think we've got to make the movement cool.
Yep.
And to me, there's nothing cooler than rebelling against authority in the status quo.
Yep.
And to me, when polarization is, it's the counterculture and the rebels, I think, are the ones that are going to raise their hand and say, hey, that's what I want to be a part
That's
of.
such a
That's
smart
what
way
the
to
cool
put it.
kids are doing.
That's such a smart way to put it.
Yeah.
Well,
But
we're
it's-
the
but
Rebel
it
Alliance.
is-
We should now get this podcast sponsored by Star Wars. We are we are the Rebel Alliance, and the Empire, which is polarization, is the status quo. I think that is a great way to put it. That we are moving things forward.
And yeah, and that's exactly it. But I'm like, I believe that people fundamentally want to be a part of something bigger than themselves.
Yep.
And this movement is bigger than me. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than all of us. But
Yes.
it's like going to the farmer's market. There's something that feels good about, I guess that's my tribe. My tribe is a diverse tribe, or going to Arts in the Heart, or just talking to people where they are in bars and restaurants nationwide. It's just, it encourages me in the humanity of our nation and our world. But I think, but I will say this, Manu, I think there are going to be lots of challenges to what we do.
Oh,
And
yeah.
people are going to try to paint, whether it's Bridge USA, Starts With Us, any of the other bridge building organizations. Oh, well, that's namby-pamby. That's just another form of being liberal, which it is not in the least. And to have the courage to sit down with somebody that doesn't have share your beliefs and have a constructive conversation, that's being a rebel to me, and that's being going against the status quo of polarization. It's pretty cool, I think.
I wanna underscore the point of courage there, uh, which is that people think, as you're saying, that having a conversation with someone that you disagree with is a simple act. Well, if it was so simple, then why isn't everyone doing it? If it was so
Yep.
easy, why do you know how many people, Deke, I come across that say, "Gosh, we want this," and then I ask them, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And they say, "It's too hard."
Yeah.
This work, this notion of listening, hearing, empathizing, understanding, whatever it is that you want to call it, being open minded, cherishing diversity, uh, it is a fundamentally courageous act because it is an act that very few people are able to master. You look at our greatest social change leaders, from Mahatma Gandhi to Martin Luther King to Nelson Mandela, um, to conservative and liberal presidents that have cherished, whether it is Ronald Reagan or Dwight D. Eisenhower or FDR or Lincoln. None of those people were ideologues. And every single one of them were focused on one thing, which is how do we create a society where people feel valued, feel opportunity, feel like they can express themselves, feel like they have a voice. This is a movement of the future. And so the last thing I would say on this point is that you talked about how this is not just about you and I. And that is 100% right. I started this podcast with the notion that this is highly accessible work that every one of us can do. You, the audience, this movement is you. This is about us. So this is not a movement of figureheads and leaders. This is a movement of the people. And when people realize that, and they suddenly realize that they have the social permission to externalize this stuff, the same way that Black Lives Matter sign lawns littered the landscape because suddenly people had the permission to be able to put those out there, or people had the permission, let's say you're a conservative and you prefer President Trump, people had the permission to advertise their guns. We've got to give people the permission to advertise this movement. And to your point, it's got to be cool and exciting. That's exactly right.
Well, and that's the thing to me is because I've seen it. I've been out there, nationwide, as I say, where people are, and I'm listening to them and I hear them, or at the farmers market. People want this, but we've got to give them a way in. And I agree completely with you. So for our listeners, you have permission, and there are so many people out there in the bridge building sector doing great work. But I personally don't think it gets enough media attention, and that maybe that's by design
Look,
because
it's not
I think
exciting.
that people
It's
want to come.
oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Deke.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just jumping in, but there might be a lag. I was just saying, you said that the work doesn't get as much media attention. It's because it's stuff that doesn't immediately get clicks.
Yeah.
What the polarizers and the tribalizers have realized is that just as much as we would like to think that we as people are driven by love and empathy, we're also driven by hate and fear. Humanity is
Yeah.
a two-sided coin. And And so we've got to play on that card of human nature is people want to be driven by love and empathy, and yet the only thing they get is fear and anger. And it's what drives clicks.
Yeah. And that to me, though, I love and empathy are powerful motivators. I get that anger and fear are the most powerful motivators, but just for I go back to being rebellious. I'm like, if you're letting individuals or organizations manipulate you through anger and fear, you're being played. And personally, I don't like to be played, but people are being manipulated without even knowing it for profit, whether it be political or monetary profit. It's, people use anger and fear to manipulate you, but don't be manipulated. To our listeners. And no, here again, I would say, Manu, there are more of us out there than there are of them. So here again, I'm trying to unite the tribe.
I have a question for you on that, which is, do you think, Deke, that we need to, as bridge builders, do you think that we need to play a little bit on people's us versus them mentality and paint a them? You get what I'm saying? Do you think that we need to start a little bit in our work being more pointed, being more sharp, being able to describe that there is a quote-unquote enemy is a strong word, but there is a quote-unquote force of folks that are fundamentally opposed to democracy and to listening and to hearing. I'm curious how you sort of navigate that, because I think there is an opportunity there, but it does feel against the notion of bridge building, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I basically generalize it, and I don't define who the enemy is. I just make the statement, which I think is true, that I believe people want to be united around common causes and want to get along with their neighbors and everything. But I'm not naive enough to know that there are individuals and organizations that profit greatly by keeping polarization going. And that's just reality. I'm not going to define who that is, because there are probably some individuals and organizations that are doing it that don't even realize what they're doing and the damage that it's doing.
Yeah, it's something that I've been wrestling with, and I think one of the things that our movement needs to be better at is identifying who's in the tent and who's not in the tent. We need to, definitionally, we need to stand for something so that people know who is not standing for that thing. If we assume that it is right that people get motivated by groups, the challenge I think we face, and this is my opinion, is not that. I think the challenge is, can we create a group that is larger than those tribes, but definitionally, because it's a group, there is a them. Because I think that, as you described it, polarization is the status quo. Polarization is the enemy. There are folks that profit off of our ability to be divided, and there are folks that are profiting off of, as you said, and playing with our emotions. And so I think that while we need to be calling in folks, I think there is also an opportunity to call out folks, because it is true, I think, that people are motivated by that fear to an extent. And I think that from a strategic perspective, but also from an empathy perspective, it puts us at a strategic and tactical and human disadvantage to not recognize and account for the fact that there are folks that will continue dividing, and if we don't take their tools and weaponize it against them, then we're losing.
Well, I will tell you, we could talk all day, and I'm sure we will spend more time talking all day.
I know. I'm sorry. I
just
don't know the time of the podcast.
No, man, this is awesome. I would love to be able to talk all day if we had all day, but I just want to tell you, I know how much you and BridgeUSA inspire me, and it just gives me hope for the future of our nation. And it kind of reminds me, when I ran for office, people said, as you've said, why would you want to get mixed up in all that? And I said, well, if, I was 37 years old, I'm like, if nobody tries to change it, it's never going to change. And so for you to stand up and for everybody with Bridge USA to stand up and say, we understand we have fundamental problems, polarization being primary amongst them, that need to be solved for the future of our nation and the future of our democracy, for you to have the foresight to do that. But I believe that our nation is going to be in very good hands with your generation.
Deke, I am so grateful to be here. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. The reason why we will win is because authoritarians and profiteers of division bet on the submissiveness of the human spirit, and those that like democracy and cherish empathy bet on the strength of the human spirit. We are pro-human. We are pro empathy, love, engagement. And to every young person out there that is working for Bridge, you are on the front lines, and I'm just a vessel for our message. So thank you to all those young people that are on the front lines advocating for this work. And more importantly, to anyone that's listening, as Deke has said so many times, this work is accessible and this is for you. So get out there and get involved. We got a movement to build.
Amen. Well, as we wind down, I have two questions for you. One, where can our listeners and viewers find you?
Feel free to go to my Instagram, Manu Meel _, Twitter, and then bridgeusa.org. If you're a young person, we got to get a chapter started in college campus or high school. So let's get something going.
And shout out to my friends at UTEP that have one now. But
there we go.
But my final question for you is, on a regular basis, what puts a smile on your face and brings joy to your heart?
Conversations like these. Being in company with folks like you, whether it is my family members, community leaders like yourself. And let me tell you why these types of conversations bring me joy. It's because I think that we as people appreciate kindness. We as people want to be loved. We want to be appreciated. And when you can talk to folks, and when you can especially have a conversation with someone that came into that dialogue completely pessimistic about the prospects of that dialogue and left having learned something, that is huge. So conversations like these, I appreciate being here, man.
Well, I will tell you, Manu, thank you for being an awesome guest. To our listeners and viewers, remember to subscribe to the podcast. If you like it, please rate us. And once again, I look forward to having you back again soon, Manu. Thank you.
Thank you, Deke.
Dropping the mic, and we are out.